Now, before I start here, I need to make clear that I've never really had much love for the original Roadhouse. When it came out, I appeared to be the only one of my social circle who wasn't obsessed with this film. When I revisited it in later years to see if my opinion had altered, what I found was a film that has a good central lead in Patrick Swayze, but it was still a pretty terrible film that would sit nicely in a bargain bin DVD rack in a petrol station somewhere. So without that beholden adoration of the earlier film, I watched this updated version pretty much on its own merits. In this updated take, Jake Gyllenhaal plays ex-UFC fighter Elwood Dalton, who earns money on the underground fighting circuit, having stepped out of the professional arena after a fight that went tragically wrong. He finds himself approached by Frankie, played by Jessica Williams, the owner of a bar in Florida Keys named the Roadhouse, which has found itself the target of biker gangs who are sent to intimidate Frankie into closing up and selling the land to developer Ben Brandt, played magnificently by Billy Magnuson. Dalton reluctantly takes the gig, keeping a calm-mannered approach to trouble, but calmly displaying his fighting skills when the need arises. However, things start to escalate when Brandt's father sends in his psychotic enforcer, Knox, played by Conor McGregor, to move things along. This film is still quite basic, and it's dumb with the plot, much like the original, but it has a lot more energy and fun that help carry it along better, in my opinion, than the Swayze version did. Doug Liman directs action with a slickness and sometimes brutal manner, although there are a few moments of CGI elements that do sadly undo a lot of the otherwise thrillingly superb work. The strong choreography on display in some of the key moments, usually with Dalton very calmly dispatching multiple attackers at once, allows you to look past this CGI and enjoy the thrill on offer. Gyllenhaal captivates in the central lead, with his subdued nature and somewhat nonchalant attitude contrasting well with his physicality. An early scene where he dispatches a gang of bikers is brutal, slick, and hilarious all at once, especially when followed up with Dalton then driving those that he injured to the hospital, which allows for an unnecessary love interest in the guise of Ellie, played well by Daniela Melchior. That early scene also leads to an ongoing amusement, with one of the gang seemingly taking a friendly liking to Dalton, despite him having had his arm broken by him, and he exchanges pleasantries with him in later confrontations. It's in the casual levity of such moments that the film is lifted somewhat, making it almost cartoony in nature, but in a good way. This is a throwback to 80s style of action film nonsense, only given a modern edge to it. It is nonsense, and it knows it's nonsense, so it simply churns out what would be cinematic fun of the kind that you leave your brain at the door, had Amazon not chosen to drop it directly onto their service, something that irked director Doug Liman a great deal. I feel that this would look great on the big screen, and a lot of the small issues that people are having with it wouldn't be as noticeable in that environment. The weakest element, however, is the casting of Conor McGregor as Knox. Yes, he's got physicality, but his whole character takes a step too far into pantomime villain territory, and McGregor is certainly no actor. Offering psychotic threat and menace in an over-exuberant manner, he stands out like a sore thumb in moments when things should be a little more grounded. But overall, this is Gyllenhaal's film, and he more than sells the central role of Dalton, allowing us to simply enjoy a simple throwback to action nonsense of an earlier decade. The Ghostbusters are back in New York again after the events of the previous film. Callie, Gary, Trevor, and Phoebe have now taken residence in the old firehouse after the events of Afterlife, and are using the old equipment to follow in the legacy of those before them to bust some ghosts. However, when an ancient evil that's been contained for centuries threatens to escape once more, the Ghostbusters old and new must join forces to prevent the world from becoming a frozen empire of darkness. Ghostbusters Afterlife in 2021 did a great job of blending nostalgic elements of the original film with a new cast of characters to bring audiences back into this world of proton packs and traps. Introducing Paul Rudd, Carrie Coon, Finn Wolfhard, and McKenna Grace, whilst having short cameos by the original team, any nostalgic nods felt inherently part of the story that was being presented and drove home the heart of the film, feeling naturally inserted. By the end of that film, with the tease of the return to the firehouse, the hope was we could look forward to seeing the new family pick up the mantle and lead the way into something fresh. Unfortunately, it appears that the lesson that Gil Keenan took from the reception to Afterlife was that fans want bait and nostalgia berries, resulting in a script that has forced inclusion in this film of far too many reminders of earlier films. Disappointingly, when we should be getting a film focusing on the new Spengler family and Gary, they get mostly sidelined throughout, whilst Aykroyd's Ray and Hudson's Winston go around introducing even more faces to the roster. Thus, screen time gets used up by Patton Oswalt, who helps with research that they could have just had any member of the team do anyway. But hey, you've got to have cameos. We also get the introduction of Winston's Paranormal Investigation Lab, staffed with cameos from James Acaster and multiple others, as well as Lucky Domingo, who coincidentally pops back in from Afterlife for, reasons. The lab itself is ham-fistedly introduced when the ghost storage at the firehouse is struggling, with Winston simply nonchalantly taking them along to this lab that he has more storage on at a whim, making you wonder, why hasn't he actually told them about this lab previously? And don't get me started on the, again, forced inclusion of podcasts that adds naught to the film. Kumail Nanjiani also joins the franchise as Nadeem Razamadi, whose actions in selling his grandmother's collection are the catalyst that sets off the chain of events, and he offers some amusing moments with his typically awkward approach to interactions, but again were dragged away from the central core characters too much, and only McKenna Grace gets some time to grow in her part this time, as she befriends a ghost named Melody, and almost starts a subplot looking at the ethics of busting ghosts, before the film bottles it completely and dangles nostalgia for the audience instead. And it's in that nostalgia dangling that the film really undoes itself. Anytime things get potentially interesting, it wheels out another character or ghost from the first film to wave in front of you and remind you what you used to love. Key phrase being, used to. William Atherton returns as Peck, he's now the mayor, and he takes up screen time for what is overall inconsequential to the events, even when he strips them of all their belongings, shutting down the Ghostbusters forever. 5 minutes later, a van rocks up with, you guessed it, proton packs and traps for them to use. Thus, the biggest issue is signposted. Nothing feels consequential throughout because nothing is allowed to gather any momentum. Ideas are raised and casually discarded just to give it a scattershot slice of nostalgia. It's such a shame because had the cameos and nostalgia been dialed back somewhat, and more screen time be given to the woefully underserved Carrie Coon and Paul Rudd, this could have been a great new start for a new era of Ghostbusters. Finn Wolfhard gets absolutely nothing to do throughout this, and feels so separate from the main story at times that you wonder if he was tied into Stranger Things shooting schedules instead. All he does through this is capture another nostalgia berry, Slimer, for, laughs. In the end, Frozen Empire is visually marvellous, but vacuously empty, and it's a huge disappointment.